Hello, everyone. My name is Charlotte Potter-Kasich. I'm the executive director here at the Barrie Art Museum, and we are excited to welcome a special guest today. Stuart is here from Theoryals. He's been an incredible mentor in shaping our space, so we're excited to have a conversation all about doll collecting. But first, I want to give you a little history about the Barrie Art Museum. We were founded in 2018 by collectors Carolyn and Dick Barrie. They have a really fascinating and I would say boutique collection of paintings, contemporary glass, and then historic dolls and automata. When it first came here, people sort of wondered, how are you going to merge all these somewhat disparate things into this space? Well, we've done it in a really interesting way with small interventions where sometimes you'll see a painting or a piece of glass in the doll galleries. We posture here that the doll is a piece of art, that it's a sculpture, not so much a plaything. And so you'll see that reflected in the display. You'll see that it's a little bit more sparsely displayed perhaps than other collections, because we want there to be visual space for the eye to rest and for people to really consider these masterful artworks. I want to say, as an artist myself and a maker, I am absolutely astounded by the doll. I am a glassblower by trade, and so the eyes always took me. But the marriage of materials is the thing that's really captured my heart. So Stuart, tell us a little bit about your connection to the Barries and how we all got here.
This is, and I think for a lot of people to understand the context and the importance of this museum, not just in Hampton Roads or Virginia or the East Coast, but the world, because it is the first art museum that has actually embraced the idea of a doll as a work of art. This is an historical moment. Previously, we had doll museums.
Absolutely.
The people who went to doll museums were typically doll collectors, which is fabulous. However, they never really had an opportunity to expose the general public, you could call them the others, as to the importance of over 300 years of doll artistry, the sculptors, the materials, the objects that were made, the meaning behind them, the stories. They are as important as a painting, as a piece of glass. They have relevance in this conversation, and certainly this is the opportunity for that general public to suddenly have that aha moment of realizing a doll is much more than what their perceived idea is. And so this is what Carolyn's vision really allowed us in the world today. I'd known Carolyn for many, many years as a collector. And it's interesting, the difference of knowing her as a collector, but then her vision changing to the museum aspect, because they are two fundamentally different things. A collector buys what they love and what they want to be surrounded by. But from a museum perspective, you need to think in broader terms, because you have to appeal to a broad audience. It's no longer your collection, it's now the world's collection. So the interesting thing in working with Carolyn was helping her, which wasn't difficult because she gets it right away. She has incredible vision, was her seeing that she had to branch out from her classic love of French bébés, which was the main focus of her home collection. And so with that, we worked together in a very rapid time. So it was not just building the museum structure, which this beautiful place here in Norfolk, but as well building out the collection to be better embraced in a museum aspect. She did it with gusto, she did it with speed, and with incredible vision that I am still in awe of today, what Carolyn was able to do in just a few years to make this one of the greatest art museum exhibit of dolls in the world.
She really has. She has incredible vision for what she's done here. And it's interesting how the collection has become almost encyclopedic, you know, from her original private passion to a more public one. And we want to thank you for all of your support over time to help us build out the collection and bolster all the different subsections.
It's been a pleasure, not only working with Carolyn, but seeing the continued vision of the museum expand and how you are even more embracing the art aspect rather than just calling it a doll wing and having just dolls lined up like soldiers. You're really kind of helping people to open their mind and understand how they relate to art, so that people just aren't entering a doll wing. They're entering the wing of a museum, an art museum, and seeing dolls within that context. And
Right.
that is fabulous, how it's growing and evolving into this idea.
Thank you. Well, today we're going to talk a lot about the reinstallation of the doll gallery. But before we go in, we are located on Old Dominion University campus, which means that we have a few different niche audiences. Of course, we have the doll collectors, but we also have our students and our faculty from over 5 different schools across campus. And of course, then our regional folks, and then tourists. So there's a lot of different groups that come through here. And for that reason, we've established a changing gallery. And that changing gallery has different shows every 6 months or so. And there's 2 that have been closely related to dolls. The first was the Karen Lamont show, which was so fun, and that's a different conversation for another day. But she's a contemporary sculptor who is inspired by Theatre de la Mode and those fashion dolls. And so it was a really fun exhibit that talked a little bit about contemporary concerns, but how they were all inspired by these wonderful Parisian fashions. The next show that recently closed is Motion Emotion, which unpacks the automata as the precursor to modern day robots. And it was really fun to work with different folks across campus and have examples of robots that are made right here. So as you come into the doll gallery, you're going to start to see that we have broken it up into 4 quadrants. And these quadrants are topical. Another major goal of this reinstallation was to establish a changing exhibition space at the heart of our gallery so that we could tease out certain topics and every 6 months be able to have changing exhibitions that look at different topics. So the one that's on view right now is Carolyn's Bebes. Should we start there?
Sure.
Because it really does reflect the heart of her collecting and sort of the beginning of her collecting. So here we are. It's called The Great Exhibition, Bebes at the Berry.
And what I love about this little exhibit space, which used to just be a standard room or a standard area for exhibits, is now become an opportunity really to explain different niche sections of dolls that people can have a great understanding. And I know as a museum lover, the greatest thing I enjoy about a museum is not just looking at the object, but reading the stories, because really the story is the object. As I recently wrote in my book, Never Ending Stories, that every object is more than just the aesthetic. It is what is the life behind that, who made it, who owned it, what it was its purpose. And that's what I love about the exhibits. It allows you to do, again, what I call before that deep dive into one particular niche or subject. And for this, the entry to read and learn, not just for doll collectors, but for the general public. And I think for the doll collectors out there who say, oh, but we know all of this, the important part of the message here with the Berry Art Museum is that it's not all about doll collectors. What we want to do is educate all people into the idea of what is a bebe, because a person coming in who's just a visitor to the museum, you would say to them, oh, there's an incredible collection of bebes, and they would say, what's a bebe?
It's true.
Now they come and they're like, I had no idea, and they read the history. So this is an incredible little room that you'll have a number of rotating exhibits over the years. I believe the next one after this is on Madame Alexander.
It is, yes.
And who's, perhaps the most iconic figure in the world of the American doll. And so, again, allowing that zeroing in on one particular facet. So here you see not every bebe in the world, but a wonderful breakdown of allowing you, the person, to come in, not to be so overwhelmed with lineups of what I call soldiers, but rather very artfully and beautifully displayed sort of panorama of the history of the bebe, not only in the costuming, but the manufacturing, and what I love as well, explanations all the way through so that the general public can really have an idea how the bebe evolved from what I would call a more romantic and visualized aspect of a child into the later in years as they became more character-oriented, and a lot of it being the changes in society and
absolutely
that dolls maintain.
So one thing that we do here at the Berry is we have a curator that we work with, different guest curators. And for this show, we worked with somebody named Sarah Woodbury. And she's an academic from William and Mary doing her PhD. And so she really has a different gaze, I would say, as she's approaching these objects. She's thinking them as historical objects. She's thinking about how they are sort of nostalgizing as well as romanticizing this notion of childhood. She talks a lot about how specifically a lot of these would have been affluent children, and they're not actually necessarily accurate depictions of what would have been happening culturally for all children by any means, but certainly showing a romanticized version of what that childhood might look like. Another thing that she was really fascinated with is women's labor and thinking about the working class and the role of women in the making and the manufacturing of these objects. And so we've included some imagery here as well to sort of show them working and how this would have been an acceptable trade at the time because it was thinking about nurturing. It's something you could have brought home with you while you were raising children. And so she wanted to sort of uplift some of those voices that maybe people weren't as aware of when it came to the manufacturing of the doll.
You bring up, again, why it's wonderful to have an art museum focused on this is that you tend to look at things from a different perspective as well. This is part of Old Dominion University, and so the museum is also an educational tool for students. And so you're bringing up and you see opportunities that doll collectors might not necessarily zero in on, because they look at the beauty of the doll.
Right.
So having museum sort of architects behind a lot of the exhibits and the space now allows a different perspective that reaches into other sort of, as I said, the others, into areas that they might find appealing. As a matter of fact, you're bringing up women. Women's studies has become a huge part of the university experience
Absolutely.
Nowadays. Showing women through the years with doll making is a really important part of recognizing that this was one of, as you said, the first opportunities for women to begin to develop in the workplace.
Right.
As a matter of fact, in America, in the 20th century, it would become women who would primarily dominate the industry, right up to Madame Alexander, who became one of the greatest entrepreneur stories of women in America. And so this is an incredible opportunity, again, to show different ideas within doll making over the years.
So one thing that we do with every one of our changing exhibitions is that we take a minute to create an exhibition advisory committee. And for this show, we had people from fashion merchandising, gender studies, as well as entrepreneurship, and even communications and marketing. So when you think about the way that Gemot was marketing these dolls at that time, and the incredible displays they were putting together for the World's Fair. We sort of use the World's Fair as this platform to think about how it really was in so many ways the World Wide Web of its time, right? So you couldn't necessarily personally travel to all these different places, but you could go to this exposition and see all of these different countries. And so it was really fascinating. We thought a lot about the fact that now we just go online, but then this would have been the Mecca. This would have been the moment, right? The physicality of that space, which now, of course, is all virtual.
It's funny that you talk about, yes, Mark, I discuss this a lot and how marketing you could do an entire research paper, a book about marketing in the world of dolls. I recently wrote an article about two Cupid dolls that in the early 20th century were contracted to have one of Ansel Adams' closest photographer buddies. He was hired by the California Raising Council to do a photo shoot of dancing Cupids to use as an advertisement for raisins.
That's
and they was
hysterical.
Used in the and now going into the exhibitions that you talk about.
Yeah.
In the San Francisco exhibition, which I'm trying to think was 1915. I don't recall exactly, but they had a whole booth about raisins, and these Cupid dolls were the central theme.
Isn't that interesting?
Dancing Cupid. So you see how everything connects in all of this.
Absolutely.
And marketing with dolls, the #1 mayonnaise brand in the world is Cupid mayonnaise out of Japan.
Isn't that
so
fascinating?
So dolls can relate to marketing as well. And then you talk about, it's interesting how you talk about business and all of these areas that an educational university here can utilize. The study of Émile Jumeau, right here, is a story in itself. He was a character. He called himself the Roi de Poupée, the king of dolls. And he was very flamboyant, and he believed and said, no, we will make this character doll, people will love it, but he was way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
They would eventually, this would become the norm, but he was too much too soon.
Yeah.
And I love studying not only the artistry of it, but the fact of the history and the story behind how it was revolutionary, but a failure.
Maybe we could walk over to the fashion section and explore some of the pieces over there. I think back to Hooray. Hooray's been a doll that I just keep on coming back to lately because she was a fabulous entrepreneur.
Again, women in the history of dolls.
True.
We can go all through history, but I believe you're correct. Adelaide Hooray was really by far the pioneer for women in dolls, because she developed her own company, and it was a boys' world back then. You think of dolls, you think, well, of course it would be a woman. No, it was a male-controlled industry for many, many years, and she was one of the very few women to break through and became and produced what are considered today to be the culmination of the French fashion. Not only in the presentation of the doll, which she made one of the most beautiful fashion dolls ever created, but she was a genius marketer, as we talk about. And you talk about Barbie today, or again, relating it to things that people might understand who are not doll collectors. Barbie, American Girl. The doll is just the centerpiece that you get. What they do, though, is market all the accessories around it.
Absolutely.
That's where they're really focused on. Hooray revolutionized this. You didn't just buy a doll. You bought an entire life for this doll. In clothing, accessories, furniture, everything. You built what were called trousseaus. Really interesting how Hooray was the touchstone of 19th century, sort of giving us the idea of the doll, not only as a plaything, but really as an educational tool for young girls to learn to build her wardrobe, to learn to dress like a lady. And this was an incredible moment in that time to be able to give children something different than just a play doll, but rather a doll that was a tool to learn to become a young woman. And Hooray is the culmination of this artistry. However, it really does extend and was popular throughout. There were many different French fashion companies. As a matter of fact, we talked about Émile Jumeau earlier. It was Émile Jumeau's father, Pierre-François, that actually started the Jumeau company with a poupée, with a fashion doll. And it was only Émile Jumeau later on that saw, oh, wait, bébés are the way to go. We want to convert more to making bébés, which was the evolutionary process at that time. But French fashions really are the origins of most of the French doll companies of the 19th century. And here's a number of incredible examples from Carolyn's collection, now the Barry Art Museum collection, including, which I always love associating this particular doll, because we talk so much about the conversation of Barbie these days, and everything.
It opens this Friday, and we're all going. The whole team's going.
I know. But this is interesting in that here is really the first Barbie.
It's true.
It's a Radico and Codonnier French fashion from the 19th century. Look at the shape, look at the face, but even more important, the very first Barbie came with a stand that inserted into the bottom of the feet. Guess what? They weren't the first. Radico and Codonnier did it, and many of them come with an original wood-based stand that fits into the bottom of the feet. So, you know, again, fashions, you can see the evolution of doll making well into modern times and how they influence and impact.
One really exquisite piece I always like to sort of settle on for a moment, the Petit Prince here. And he is such an interesting amalgamation of different things. Obviously, he's an 1884 doll, but the costume is from about about 1962. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about this very specific costume and who made it?
Again, showing how fashion intersects with dolls over lifetimes. This actually is a French Bis Bébé from Jameau, but was part of the Huguette Clark collection. Huguette was the great heiress of the Senator Clark's copper fortune of the 19th and early 20th century. She lived well into the 2000s, as a matter of fact, and passed away, I believe, at 104. And she was incredible because as this very, very wealthy New York heiress, she had a love affair with Christian Dior's fashion and designs. But she also loved her dolls. And then she thought, well, wait a minute. Fashion dolls were having couture designs. Margaine Lacroix was making dolls that we'll talk about later on for Albert Marc. Margaine Lacroix is now considered really the forerunner of many of the styles that came out of France in the turn of the century period. So Huguette's vision was, why not just call Christian Dior and have them make some costumes?
I'll write him some letters. He's a good old friend of mine.
And of
we got
course,
the letters right here.
She was one of the best customers of Christian Dior in New York. Well, of course, they would make custom costumes just for her. Not only Christian Dior, she actually contacted Cartier.
Oh, interesting.
And Cartier made special little doll-sized jewelry for some of her bébés.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So really interesting how fashion does intersect all through the world of dolls. Even today, Barbie is an absolute look at 5 decades, 6 decades, 7 decades now almost of fashion across the world. You have the early period of the late 50s, you get into the 60s, then the mod period. And it's interesting, the mod period now is one of the hottest areas for collecting.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, and so
because everything comes back. It all folds back on itself.
Exactly. And Barbie is nothing more than a look at fashion through the ages. So again, step out of the perception of dolls. Step into the idea of how many other areas they impact in our society and world and culture today. Fashion being one of the most important.
Absolutely. And speaking of world fashions, maybe we can end this section talking a little bit here about these brews. So we like having these because we do want to unpack some of the colonial undertones of a large part of our entire collection. And these obviously are Western gaze on African people. Not necessarily completely accurate, but what they would have either imagined or seen. And so these are the kinds of things that people would have seen at World's Fairs, perhaps?
Yes. The world exhibitions you mentioned earlier were not only just a product unveiling, but they were a cultural unveiling.
Absolutely.
Where countries from around the world could be represented or shown, and people became, as a result, very fascinated with Asian. That's when Japanese art and Japanese fashion and style became really trendy in Paris. African, the study of African art and costumes as well, became really intriguing. And so the doll makers, again, given the fact that they are representing the culture of that time, began to make dolls to sort of honor this fascination across the world with what at the time were considered more exotic cultures.
Absolutely.
And so you will see many doll makers, Jameau, Bru, across the board in France in the 19th century, creating dolls that were specifically done with, as close as they could derive, costumes of different locations and periods. Matter of fact, in Philadelphia at the World Exhibition, and I'm forgetting the year, but it was in the 19th century, probably 1870s or 80s, Jameau brought over a whole selection of about 20 dolls, all individually, uniquely costumed in different African styles.
Interesting.
And were put on display at the Philadelphia exhibition.
Right.
And so, yes, exhibitions were the place, but it really helped. This was an opportunity for people. In 1875, you couldn't Google the traditional costumes of Senegal. You went to these exhibitions and you saw them on display, and you studied and looked, and this is how people were exposed to many of these cultures that they otherwise never would have been.
Absolutely. It's very interesting. These are historical objects of their time, and that's one thing that we work very hard to categorize them as, to sort of, this is what the society was doing at that moment. It was looking outward. Globalization was starting to happen.
Right.
Industrialization was starting to happen. Colonization was definitely happening. And so there was this interesting fascination. Yeah. So moving along, let's head on over to our technology section. So one of the rarest dolls in our collection is the Rochard doll here. It is this beautiful intersection between both fashion and technology. And it's the piece that I would say is one of our absolute favorites.
I call it, as a matter of fact, in my book I recently wrote, the greatest doll ever made. Because there's nothing so absolutely fascinating in the scope of creativity and what was he thinking in when he created this?
Yeah, can we back it up for a second? Because I'd like to unpack what's happening here. Every single one of these is a stanhope, right? So there's 26 different stanhopes. And inside those stanhopes, those little micro photographs that are inside of there are different Parisian scenes or different places that people go on pilgrimages or spas, things of that nature, that affluent people of Parisian times would have gone to. But one of the things I find the most fascinating is that you would have had to bury your nose in the bosom of this doll to see any of these.
Look at this.
Which is such a classically Parisian moment. Every time I actually think about the mechanics of seeing this, it just cracks me up.
It is, but there's a certain eccentric brilliance to the whole idea that is why I call it the greatest doll. Because who else but Rochard could have come up with this concept? Now, Rochard, first of all, is not a doll maker. He was a person absolutely obsessed with microphotography, which in the 19th century was really developing in the 1860s, 70s, 80s as a sort of fad at the time. They were originally used a lot of times, little microphotographs, to be carried by pigeon across war lines to generals to give them troop positions, and that was they were the first spy sort of photographs. But it really developed as sort of a trend as well in culture in France at that period. And so Rochard would take photographs all over France of historical sites, and then he came up with this idea of creating the stanhope and utilizing a doll as sort of the delivery platform, if you will, of this ability to look inside. Now, many things are used today in microphotographs. It's still a popular trend, and you'll find stanhope pens and lockets and very popular. But a doll, a whole doll, and I believe 26 stanhopes, incredible. And there was even, and people don't realize this too, but there's even a kaleidoscope inside that you can see. So it's just fantastical. And
it's totally fantastical. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that as a maker and as a glassblower myself, and someone who's done a lot of experimentation with optics, the other thing that's so fascinating about this is you would have had to remove the back of it to get the backlighting for it to for both the kaleidoscope and the stanhopes to really be viewed properly. So there was a piece of dismantling your piece to be able to get the optical illusion, which I also find equally fascinating and strange that it really was meant to be handled in that way.
It was. And obviously, and again, we talk about some of the greatest, most genius creations in the world of dolls have been commercial failures, because clearly he didn't sell a whole lot of these dolls.
Right.
But still,
because they didn't have bodies, right? When you first got one, you just got the
So very
bust.
few of these exist. I mean, a handful across the world. And then to find them with the stanhopes intact, like your example here, which I love how you presented close-up views, because it's difficult, obviously, in the case. And then a little background and history of some of the photographs inside really brings it to life. This is what you peer in and see. And little famous sites around Paris or France. They could be street scenes as well, just common Parisian street scenes. So having this in a museum and allowing for this presentation really brings the importance of this piece.
I love this cross section here, and we've actually spoken with the photography department. This is one of the wonderful things about being part of a university. So the photography department loves this piece. The sculpture department, the glass students love this piece. The fashion students love this piece. So this piece just sits at this beautiful intersection between so many departments here on campus and so many different people's.
Every doll does.
Yeah.
That's what we've been trying to say. And what the Barry Art Museum allows is that now you're able to see how many facets of everything that dolls have touched in our lives. Technology, fashion.
Pop culture, literature.
Literature. Everything's been touched. For a university, that's just the tip of the iceberg. For a university, incredible teaching tools in all these departments, but for the general public to see this. And that's what I love in this new layout that you've created for the doll gallery. You take out the just chronology of it and bring in how dolls intersect with all these parts of our culture and lives through the years.
And we have found that it has made it much more accessible to the general public to look at it this way, because people come in here and they get to see an automata, and there's one here on the screen right now who's playing the piano, and they get, although we can't always wind it up for people, we now have a video here that shows people the automata moving and functioning, the gears and the mechanisms, being able to see someone turn it. They really were some of the first immersive art installations. Hear me out. I know that might sound crazy, but they touched every one of your senses. There was the tactile component of the cranking, and then there was the audible component of the music boxes, and then of course visually they're stunning, and then finally there was an olfactory component sometimes, right? There were certain ones that actually had bellows in their arms and they could smoke. So the fact that there could be a fully immersive object that could bring you into a space like that, you're right, it was like a theater.
It was theater.
Yeah.
And many times the movements are so complex. I mean, this example, you will see, even if it's running, you will see the eyes open and close.
Right.
I mean, all these very intricate movements that were designed truly to, as you say, immerse you into this theater.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Okay, so moving along over here, we have a couple of the Daki Ningos. We've been working with Alan Scott Pate to build out this collection quite a bit. And we just love this pair of dolls for a number of reasons. Of course, they have like the human hair and the glass eyes. But I became really interested in knowing that they also were sort of the first surrogates for women who had lost children. So it would have been something that people would have held, and it would have been normal to see a woman walking through the streets holding one. But the mechanics are fascinating, being able to squeeze it and having that bellows and some of the first talking dolls. So this little pair right here is something that we've found has been really, really interesting to speak with students about.
And you mentioned Alan Scott Pate, who works with you as well on the Japanese part of the exhibit, and he is one of the greatest, most knowledgeable people in the world on the subject. So I know he's helped you bring these into the museum, and they are really great additions in showing, again, that the culture of doll making was not just European, not just
wasn't
American.
Just Western.
It was all across the world.
So yeah, we work with different experts for all of these different topical components. And so we've worked with a number of guest curators, and he's been one. So one of the new installation components over here, which has been wonderful for some of our younger audiences, as well as our sculpture students, is unpacking the dolls and materials. What are the different materials that are used? Although this is not a chronology at all, and obviously is varied in all of these different techniques of creating, it starts to really think about let's really think about these different materials and what's being used here and why. And there was different materials being used at different time periods for different reasons. So we start here with a wooden. It's one of the earliest dolls in our collection. And she would have been an example of something that's like a Pandora doll. Don't know if she actually was a Pandora doll. Then we get into the cloth dolls, which is it comes full circle back to the World's Fair. And then we get into paper mache. And this is kind of a regionally specific piece, a Leo Moss piece, and he was from Macon, Georgia, just right up the road. He's also the only African-American maker in our collection. Then we get into one of the bisque faces, bebes, and then of course the porcelain Scottish boy. And then people get really excited to think about what this face is made of, this gofun, this ground up oyster shell, which of course is regionally an interesting material for us. We have a lot of oyster beds here in Virginia. And then finally getting into composite. So this has been a really good window for us to get people interested in the making. And what I'm fascinated with is how the makers were able to marry so many different materials seamlessly to create these wonderful figurative sculptures.
This is one of the things I love that you've done. This is a recent addition into the gallery that I never imagined or thought of in this regard of dolls, because for doll collectors, for me, people who are exposed to it, we kind of take for granted the material. We just know what they're made of, and that's it. We know what a bisque doll is. We know what a porcelain doll is.
The first time somebody said this is a kid body, I was like, what? You have to unpack some of these terms for
and then
people.
So we, and this is an important, I think, lesson too for doll collectors, we tend to talk above the general public in how we present a doll. Sometimes we got to bring it down a little bit.
There's a lot of acronyms thrown in there.
We got to bring it down a little bit and kind of, as you say, unpack it for them.
Yeah.
And this is an incredible opportunity for people to see. Look at the evolution of different materials. Some were found materials that were local, that could be utilized easily. Some were materials that, like bisque, that were meant to believe to be creating the most lifelike and human-looking doll. Some were practical, like plastic and composition. They just became practical materials of the pre- and post-war era. All of these things have a place in time.
Right.
And I think it's incredible how you've broken it down for people to say, oh, these are all the different materials utilized and the function of how they found and made industries out of this. It's really great.
So one of the things that we do when we design spaces, it's a very much a collaborative effort between everyone who works here. So our collector was a major stakeholder. Carolyn helped inform a large portion of the layout. Of course, we worked with Sarah Woodbury, our guest curator, and the academic gaze. We worked with our education specialist here, Suzanne Peterson, and this was really her vision. She said one of the biggest questions we get from people who don't understand dolls is, what are these things made out of?
It's so funny because for a doll collector, we never think of like that.
Yeah.
What is this doll made of? The most simple and basic question.
Right.
But yes, for a non-collector, it's a huge component of understanding the doll.
And it's a really good window, right? It's a first entry point for people to make them feel accessible and something that they can relate to. Yeah. So let's step over into pop culture. When we think a little bit about culture, dolls, we've talked about the marketing. Doll makers were just so smart and partnered often with literature, opera, movies at some points. Of course, the one coming out this Friday.
Yes. Licensing, it's really interesting because we talk about that. Again, the business aspect, the marketing aspect that you can study in dolls is fascinating. Licensing revolutionized the doll world. Prior to the 1920s, Germany was the dominant force in doll making. Even after World War I, prior to World War II, they still sort of dominated. It was the number one export for Germany for a long period of time were dolls and toys. So it was a very big part of the economy in Germany as well. But they totally failed in recognizing one thing: licensing. And that's where the Americans really came in and took control of the entire doll world, because they recognized celebrities and all of these licensing attachments to the dolls. Shirley Temple changed it all. Mary Pickford contracted a German company, because that's were the only people making dolls at the time she was famous, to create a doll of her likeness. And she got the doll and she hated it. She felt it wasn't beautiful enough like her. And so she told the company. Now, the German company basically kind of laughed at her and said, forget it, we're not remaking this. And so the whole thing was scrapped. Can you imagine if they had pushed harder to make that doll? That would have revolutionized the idea of licensing 20 years before it became the thing. So it's really kind of interesting. The study of licensing is a whole book in itself on doll making and how it impacted. But dolls and culture, dolls could represent many different areas of the times. I mean, the Pubo dolls, created by the artist Pubo, who was one of the great illustrators and artists in Paris in the early 1900s. One of his claim to fame is creating posters that were famine relief, that for the children living in the streets of France and in very impoverished times before and after World War I. And
Which
these
you're seeing
dolls
here.
were
Yeah.
the street urchins of Paris that he painted. Well, he also created a doll for the SFBJ company that he worked on in sculpting with them. Even though he was not a sculptor, they worked with him to sculpt these dolls and create his classic Children of the Street.
It's interesting how they become a role in a lot of war relief efforts, and also even like fully ambassadors. We sort of skipped over Miss Hiroshima, but she was a little ambassador of her time and is a very important doll in the collection. And these also sort of hold that role. And I didn't ever really think of these tiny little things as things that could go out into the world and truly change.
We skipped over the Japanese friendship doll a little bit. Maybe we'll go back and look at it at some point because, wow, talk about one of the most important dolls ever made and fascinating in history and culture. They were sent to America by Japanese towns, created and with gifts from all the children would select gifts to go with the doll to be sent then to a place in America, another school in America. And when you think about when this was done, who would have known these were supposed to be friendship dolls, representations of peace and coming together? And
who knew it was about to happen?
In just a few years, our nations would be at war. And it's such a poignant representation of history of seeing how strange and how quickly times can change.
Absolutely. And how this was sort of a last-ditch effort on the part of a minister to try to... He saw this. He saw the tensions growing and thought, how can we ease these tensions? And it would be through the children, right? Like the children are the way.
The children are the way.
Yeah. So I'm going to send these...
Such a beautiful story.
I mean, it is a beautiful story, and it's a really interesting gesture.
It is.
It's unfortunate, obviously, that wasn't
the outcome.
That wasn't enough.
But it shows how fragile the world can be at times too, but how
Absolutely.
beautiful it can be, and then how quickly it can turn.
Absolutely. Yeah. But here we are. We're looking now at Miss Hiroshima. You can see her beautiful human hair, and we did fly over a specialist from Japan to help dress her kimono and make sure that everything was proper. And we're just so impressed that this particular piece still exists after World War II. You would have thought that she would have been destroyed. So she's a really exquisite example.
The majority of those that survived, there's a few in private hands, but most are in museums. Example, the Cleveland Museum of Art has one as well. You are the only one that I know that really does make an effort to have it on a full-time display, though, which I love.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it's Miss Hiroshima, which in a few years, sort of the strange story and twist and turn. This doll represents so much, and I hope for people who look at it that it represents an idea of peace.
I hope so too. I hope so too. This particular installation is really situating the doll makers next to some of the sculptors and artists that designed some of the heads. And then also, you'll see here that we have paintings that are depicting different children playing with dolls. And so one of the beautiful things that Carolyn and Dick Barry did when they were collecting is they were always trying to pair different kinds of artworks together, sort of spanning cultures and materials and times to think about thematic overlooks. And so one of the things that Carolyn always did was she wanted to collect portraits of children holding their dolls. And this is a really great example of those two.
It's fascinating, but in the 19th century, it was very much a thing at the time that your child would be painted holding his or her favorite doll.
Right.
And many times if it was boys, it was a toy. Sometimes it was two children together, each of them holding a doll and a toy. But for the young girl, always holding their different dolls. I think blending dolls as a painting and then showing as well how that intersects into doll making, because here's an Albert Marc doll who he was a sculptor, very famous sculptor at the time in Paris, and was contracted by SFBJ, the same people who contracted Poubeau to create the Poubeau dolls that we showed earlier, contracted Albert Marc to create what many consider, and I would tend to agree, the greatest art doll ever conceived. And not only in the sculpting of the doll, but again, we talk about how fashion intersects. And many people, including me, will consider fashion a form of art. And they contracted Margaine Lacroix in Paris, one of the most sought-after fashion designers of that time. She was the one who came up with the concept of the corsetless dress in Paris, which
Thank
was a
you,
great
ma'am.
scandal.
Thank you.
Yes, and came up with the wide-legged trousers. That
Also, thank you.
Yes, and so she really influenced a great deal of fashion that we see today. So having her create the costumes, Albert Mark creating the doll, it's kind of like Louis Vuitton and Banksy getting together.
Right,
you know,
right.
this is
Fascinating collaboration. So moving through here, we do have some great German characters over here. Some of these, I mean, the sculpted hair on this one is so unusual. And I mean, on a personal level, this just reminds me of my son exactly. I love the expressiveness of their faces. And to me, I don't even care that clearly the outfits are almost second to the formalness of the form, the face itself. They really capture me, and you can start to kind of project different ideas onto them because they're so lifelike.
1910 was kind of a real turning point. So, in the demise of the French doll makers of the 19th century, which really happened at sort of the turn of the century, much of it due to German competition, and the Germans learned to perfect the making of dolls in a cheaper way, and most importantly, distribution. They perfected distribution across the world. So dolls became less a luxury item and more a standard commercial item for everyone.
If you want to come here to the Barrie Art Museum, we encourage you, if you are a doll collector, to notify us first. Send us an email. Let us know, because there's a lot of dolls that are not currently on view, and we're going to give you a very special behind-the-scenes tour right now. You can see just a few that are in our storage.
Everybody loves a back room.
Okay, so if you come in here to our back room, you can see just a few of the pieces that we've pulled out to show some of the breadth of the artwork that we have in our storage. We do work with a conservator here at the Barrie Art Museum. She's incredible, and she does a lot of the work on them. So for conservation reasons, because we are a museum, a lot of the works have to rest. And I know not all collectors always do this, but here we do make sure that all of the clothes can take some time and that they have the proper light levels. And so it just gives you a little window into some of the work that people might see. And people can go online to our collection and see all of the works of art and let us know if there's certain ones they want to be able to see in person.
I think that's a fantastic approach to it. I mean, the Japanese, even in homes, have an idea that the artwork displayed should never remain in the same place over time, that it should be rotated. And so I agree that rotating many of these pieces is a fantastic idea as well, some for special exhibits that you have on reserve, but then to allow collectors, and this is the key, allow collectors to be able to call ahead of time and arrange a little backroom visual of some of these pieces. If they're doing articles or research or something that they like themselves, they can schedule an appointment, and that is a wonderful, wonderful little perk for people to have, to see not just what's there, but what's behind the scenes.
Well, because we are a research institution and located here on a university campus, we welcome researchers to come here, contact us ahead of time. We have a great library with some incredible resources and a wonderful archive as well. So we are trying to amass as much as we can to really become one of the foremost places for the study of dolls as art.
And you are already there.
Thanks, Stuart.
Yes.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you will come visit us here at the Barrie Art Museum in Norfolk,
Please
Virginia.
support this museum. Come and for doll collectors, on this, the turn of this is we have the others coming in to learn about dolls. You can come in and also learn about art glass and maritime paintings and other aspects and bring it all together.
Absolutely.
With what you love. Come on down to Norfolk. You'll have a great time.
Thanks, y'all.